Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Seamus Khan, and I'm a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. And today I'm delighted to welcome you all to an RSA online event. Thanks for joining us. I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk with the brilliant author, and actually, as it turns out, good friend of mine, Cathy O'Neil. Cathy's a mathematician as well as an author and has worked as a professor, a hedge fund analyst, a data scientist, and an occasional rabble-rouser, as well as being a musician. She holds a PhD in mathematics from Harvard University and is the founder of the algorithmic accounting company, Orca. Cathy's also an author of several brilliant books. And today we're going to talk about her latest book, which I just had the pleasure of reading this weekend, The Shame Machine: Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation. In it, she talks about the social, political, and commercial power of shame and how it's harvested by industries that prey on us and really sort of profit from producing this sentiment. In some ways, they're profiting from damages that they're doing to our communities and to ourselves. It's a fascinating exploration that weaves together social commentary and research with Cathy's own expertise on the internet, the power of algorithms, and her own personal experience. If those of you watching along would like to join the conversation about the event on Twitter, you're more than welcome to do so using the hashtag RSA Shame, or just here in the YouTube chat function. Cathy, thanks so much today for joining us. It's great to be talking with you.
Seamus, it's really my pleasure. It's great to see you.
So I wondered if you could just start by bringing the audience into the book a little bit. You talk in other books of yours, drawing really on like your expertise as a data scientist and an algorithm expert. But in this one, you sort of open with a different approach. And in some ways, it's deeply personal in how you open the book. So can you just bring us in to this text?
Sure. It's a very open-ended question, so I get a lot of leeway here. I will tell you like how I became fascinated by shame in the first place. On the one hand, I saw shame as actually a sort of underlying power of some of the sort of terrible algorithms that I'd been researching. So I had interviewed teachers who were being fired or denied tenure, which is tantamount to fired. School teachers, like public high school teachers mostly, and principals. I'd been interviewing them about like the formulas by which they are being scored and fired. And I would be like, so did you ask them to explain your score? And the teachers would be like, no, they told me it was math and I wouldn't understand it. And at the time, I just remember being like, what? Like what? That's outrageous. If somebody told me it's math, you wouldn't understand it, I would be like, no, it's your problem if you can't explain it. Because it's my right to understand why I'm being fired, right? But the fact that they didn't respond that way, number one, because they're not PhD mathematicians like me, I get it. But that's actually the point, right? That they sort of were silenced. They were silenced by that response. And it wasn't one time, it was a systemic, it was the answer I got when I asked teachers this question and principals. So it was actually a sort of an actual strategy. And it was a shaming strategy. It was like what maybe you could call it math shaming. But what was shocking to me was how much it worked, like how consistently it worked. How consistently the people were like, after that, I didn't ask any more questions. And I was like, that's fascinating because it's a terrible algorithm. It should never have happened. It should have been audited, blah, blah, blah. I could talk about the statistical failures all day. But at the end of the day, the reason it worked on an individual level was that it prevented, like that shaming aspect prevented people from fighting for their own rights. And I found that really weird.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. And I was just going to say that I didn't get it, but then 2 years later, when I was doing my own research on bariatric surgery, it happened to me. And so that's when I got it. And it was like actually that second moment where I realized, oh my God, this is happening to me. It's happening to me when I do Google searches on bariatric surgery, because it's like a weight loss surgery, even though I was going at it as a diabetes prevention surgery, which it also is. It should be called that. But it's not called that because it is just so profitable to fat shame people. And I was being fat shamed by the very kinds of digital advertisement that I used to I used to produce, I was an ad tech data scientist. So I was like, I can understand this at a rational level, but I am like blown away by the shame I'm feeling, and I can't think, and I can't advocate for myself, and I can't do this research that I know I should be able to do. And like, what's happening to me? And I was like, oh wait. And I thought of those teachers, and I was like, oh my God, I'm being shamed, and I'm being shamed viscerally, and am incapable of advocating for myself. And it's the same thing that I was observing in these teachers, and it's like a totally different context. And then I was like, oh, this has nothing to do with formulas or science. This is a mechanism, a social mechanism that silences and shames us and prevents us from, and not only just prevents us from asking further questions. It was like, I would have paid any amount of money, Seamus, like to get out that feeling out of my head if I thought it
Yeah.
could work.
I mean, I think, in reading the book as a sociologist, what I really thought about was how, in many instances, not all of them, but in many instances, what you're sort of expressing is how our social failures become individualized and internalized. So, you give examples opening of like poverty or of drug addiction, right? And so in the poverty one, it's like poverty is a social failure, but instead of thinking of it as something that we collectively have failed at, we think about it as how individuals have failed, and we shame them. And often people who are poor internalize that shame. Or when we look at drug addiction, there's a series of social failures. And, there's a failure of our society to do things to help people who struggle with addiction or that lead to conditions where they become addicts. And instead, we sort of point and say, you're doing this wrong thing. And often people internalize this. But I think what pushes this so much further is that you note that it's not just that process, it's also how corporations or industries, entire industries, profit by doing this. And so I'm curious, like, what makes shame so profitable?
Right. I mean, and you just covered like two aspects of shame. One is like what we gain by shaming other people, which is this notion of like distance, sort of psychological distance, like, oh, addicted people should be ashamed of themselves, i.e., I don't want to think that this will happen to my kids or to me or to my loved ones. Oh, poor people should be ashamed of themselves. They should behave better, make better choices, i.e., I don't want to think about poverty being a possibility for me and my loved ones. But then there's the sort of flip side, which is what happens what's the experience of being shamed. And I sort of got at that a little bit with my story about searching online for weight loss surgeries and the teachers. But the more general thing is, and I'll back up a little bit and define shame. Shame, as it's experienced, is the sort of disintegration of your sense of self. It is like it's a feeling like you are not lovable. And to be clear, it's not entirely your sense of self altogether. It's your sense of a social self, like your ability to be loved, to be in a community, and worthwhile in that community. It's extremely threatening. And it makes sense that it's threatening because, like, historically, and not just historically, but you can even see it happening right now in places like Kiev. Like, there are things that you have to sacrifice. There are conflicts, like you want something, but the community needs you to do something else, like not hoarding food during a moment of scarcity, where if you don't respond to the social cues and the social requirements, like, you will be thrown out, you will be like castigated, and possibly you will die, right? So the shame acts like as a way to sort of corral people into doing what's good for the community instead of just what's good for themselves. And the threat there is real. The threat is like, we will hate you if you're not a good community member. So going back to like the notion, the questions you said, like the poverty shame and the addiction shame, those are helpful for the people doing it, because the people who are experiencing the shame, which often does happen, they are silenced. They really do feel like I've done wrong, even when they're completely innocent. Even when they're completely innocent, like like poor children, like completely innocent. There's no possible way that they could be at fault for being born. And yet that shame acts as a way for them to be silenced and to bear the shame. Similarly, when we are in a situation of being targeted by shame in the corporate setting, so I'll just throw out weight loss, which we've already brought up, but like most cosmetics or wellness situations, like, basically, and this is a sort of traditionally female targeted set of industries, like to make women feel unattractive, therefore buy a product. It works because we feel ashamed of the way we look, and that's such a threat to ourselves. It's sort of hijacking that sort of evolutionary useful thing and just making us feel like I desperately need to conform to this notion of acceptable, beauty or looks anyway. And I will do literally anything to get there because otherwise I feel very threatened. And that means, if that means money, if that means buying products that probably don't work or almost surely don't work, that's what it'll take. That's what people will do, because that triggered, it's almost like a pre-rational thing. I think a lot of people would probably not be able to explain exactly why they care about these things, because it is pre-rational. It's like a threat that happens before we get to think through it. And so it's a really, really useful way for profiteering companies to sort of get us to buy their stuff.
Yeah, I think, what was interesting to me in reading it also was how much power and shame were intertwined with one another. And one of the nice things you do in the book, and we'll talk about this, is take up counterexamples. So you don't just talk about the disadvantaged or the people who are often subject to the power of others. But I thought a lot of the examples were sort of that character, like in a way that was really productive. So you gave this example of Vagisil in the book, which was, it's an example of, in the US, like a product that's marketed to women to, quote unquote, clean their vaginas, except, the very idea of that product, that vaginas are dirty and need cleaning, is false. There's no evidence for that at all. And it sort of supports this fantasy of, like, women needing to prepare their bodies for the satisfaction of men, and women's bodies being problems. There's sort of so much tied up into it. And I thought to myself, like, there is no equivalent product for men. Like, there is no product that says, men, your penis and testicles smell. Here's a special product to keep them clean and not repulsive. And, we see this frequently, actually, that, the marketing is to often, like, less powerful people, or the shame is placed upon less powerful people. We'll talk about examples where that isn't true, but I'm curious if you could help me understand that. Like, why is it that, the socially marginalized or the less powerful are often the sort of objects of the weight of this shame industry?
Well, before I answer that, I do want to mention that I think a lot of the products, like the ED drugs targeted mostly at older men, are kind of similar to that. And I do think it's probably because it's older men, and this is the idea of, like, masculinity is being threatened if, like, you have ED problems. So, but again, that kind of just supports your point, which is that it's like people that are vulnerable, and they're already, what's the word? Stigmatized for being older. Yeah, I think it's, the thing about it is shame is, like, kind of the oldest thing. Like, Eve got shamed out of the Garden of Eden for eating the apple, right? Like, it's like pretty much like one of those old-fashioned notions. And it does tend to, observationally, it does tend to be burden. The burden falls on the sort of youngest, weakest, least powerful member. And I have a lot of theories about that, because the theory I have, I'll just say quite directly, is that not only is shame used as profiteering, like it's a wonderful profit engine, but it also, when it's not profit, when you're looking around for like, why is shame, like punching down shame happening? I call it punching down when it's usually when it's directed at powerless people. It's usually just to just maintain the status quo. So in some sense, it's almost like a closed circuit logically, right? You're saying like, we're going to shame you to keep you in your place, to silence you, going back to the earlier point. Shame is, and because shame is so debilitating, you know, socially, it's such a socially debilitating thing where you feel threatened and contingent, like you're only halfway in to the community. Just by being in that tier of the outer tier of the community, by being in that shamed position, you don't get powerful. It's almost like, it's almost the same thing, really.
You know, when I was reading it, I couldn't help but think of Donald Trump and, you know, how among sort of commentators in sort of popular media, but also the academy, there was a constant refrain: the man has no shame.
Yeah.
And, you know, I thought also here in a British context of like the Brexit and the ways that people described Boris Johnson or Nigel as lying without shame in advocating for what it is that they wanted. And here, you know, it made me think like, wow, you know, a lot of us thought it would be better if Donald Trump had shame, because then he would have acted in a better way, or it would be better if our politicians were capable of being shamed, and that the incapacity of some people to experience shame creates a host of social problems. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you is like, how can I think through that? How can I think through the kind of critique that you have of shame with this other discourse about people who are shameless, which is often an insult or a social problem?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. Well, I would say, first of all, that Trump was not at all shameless, continues to not be at all shameless. And in fact, I think shameless is an overused term that I want us to rethink. I want, every time somebody uses the word shameless, what they really mean, in my opinion, is that this person doesn't share a norm with me that I expected them to share, and they're not like responding as I expected them to the shame that I'm trying to target them with over this norm. So just to be clear, what I'm saying is that when you shame someone, there's a norm you have in mind. There's a rule they've broken, a norm that you thought you shared with them, and you're saying, how dare you don't follow this rule. And the problem with calling someone shameless when they don't agree with a norm is that actually they probably do agree with other norms. They probably have a lot of norms they have. There's probably their own notion of community that they really desperately clinging to, that would, you know, they would derive shame from if they were told that they're not following the rules of that community. So you're kind of acting as if this person has no norms at all that they cling to, when in fact it's just one norm that you've located that they don't cling to. So a kind of extreme version of this is like, if I didn't know you, Seamus, and I saw you eating in the subway, which I'm sure you never do, because that would be not okay with me. And I'd be like, that person is shameless. But I, of course, agree with you in a lot of ways. And I don't, you're not shameless, but if you're, you know, breaking that one rule. So I guess my point is that it's just a very narrow thing that's actually happening, but it's a very broad thing to call someone shameless. Now, to get to Trump specifically, I think he is shame driven. I think he is like, knowing a little bit about his upbringing and his terrible father and, you know, bizarre. I mean, I'm not saying he's a good guy at all, but I'm just saying the guy is deeply shamed. And he has a lot of norms that you can just look at. You know, he's worried about being weak. He's worried about being unpowerful. He's worried about being stupid. He's worried about not being rich. So there's all sorts of things that he completely clearly has norms around. And for that matter, like, he has empathy. Do you know how he feels really sorry for, like, he felt really sorry for Roger Ailes when he got kicked out of Fox News. Like, it surprised me, and that people sort of called him shameless when he was like wearing his shame on his sleeves, actually. But of course, there were norms that he didn't follow that were outrageous, like democracy and truth telling. And those are norms that are so important to us that I think it's reasonable for us to say, like, that guy's beyond the pale. I think it's totally reasonable for us to say that's a norm that matters so much to me because he's the president that, it's unforgivable. Like, I totally agree with that. I'm just saying, like, shameless is the wrong term. I will just finish by saying that, politicians in a lot of ways are, there's a selection bias, I would say. Like, there's a huge amount of selection bias to get people who play the game of politics. I mean, I don't know if you've ever considered becoming a politician, Seamus. I think that would be great, but great for the country, right? But not for you necessarily, because the actual stuff you have to do and you have to agree to kind of selects away from people that are idealistic. And just thinking through that, you'll realize that, like, it's a whole different set of norms actually that we're selecting for politicians. And I'm not saying there's no good politicians. I'm just saying that it's really a different world than what we normally are happily interacting in.
So I'm curious, and maybe I should have started here, but like, I think about shame and I think about a lot of other terms that are kind of associated with it as, as a sociologist, obviously stigma, which you deal with in the opening. But I wanted to focus on one particular word as being maybe distinct from shame, and that's embarrassment. Like, what is the difference between shame and feeling embarrassed? So, I think if I were to go out onto the street and have an accident and pee my pants, I feel like I would experience embarrassment in some ways because it's not a systematic thing.
Yeah.
Maybe if it were systematic, I would feel shame. But can you help me think through the difference between the sort of affective and community level differences between shame and embarrassment?
Yeah, I mean, and I would say the same thing for, like, guilt too, like guilt versus shame. It's like you feel guilty about something you did and you feel ashamed about something you are, like, and you can, of course, there's a lot of gray area. There's ways that you can feel both. But you'd feel guilty about not recycling, like the can, like by throwing it away in the wrong place. Like, it's not like you're like, that makes me a bad person, right? So that's where you're going to shame, when you're like, it reflects on my actual self. Like, it reflects on whether I'm a good or bad person. Similarly with embarrassment, you can have an embarrassing episode, like peeing your pants or something. And then the question is, does it turn into shame? It could if that's something you're like, oh my God, that happens to me all the time. It's who I am now. It's like defines me socially. And also if it was like put up on social media, if there's a video of you peeing your pants and people were like, oh my God, who, like, that would be another way for it to enter your identity. So it has to be touching and tarnishing your notion of yourself for it to be classified as shame, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I was thinking of when I read this was this incredible book, The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Muhammad, which is a book in the US case that shows how social statistics and sociologists, people like me, in the turn of the 20th century, transformed criminal acts like crime as something that individuals did to a type of person. And in particular, they did this for Black Americans. And so what Khalil Muhammad shows in this book is how the social statistics of things like, the gathering of social information about crime rates transformed, individuals who committed crimes into people who were criminals. And in that book, Muhammad sort of shows how, the Irish committed crimes at roughly the same rate as African Americans did, but Irish people were seen as people who committed crimes and Black people were seen as criminals. And this was an analogy to me in your book because you sort of bring in your background as someone who's interested in data, algorithms, how information gets mobilized to produce this. And so, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit, particularly here from your section on network shame, about how it is that the internet or large corporations or these sort of broader organizations participate in and even facilitate this transformation.
Yeah, I want to encourage everyone who hasn't already to read Gary Steingart's book called Super Sad True Love Story, which was written like a long time ago, like before Occupy, but like not only predicted Occupy, but also predicted the surveillance society we can currently live in. And he had this notion of like these, a credit score, a social credit score that actually kind of already exists in China, by the way. That's actually another important thing. It was like radically transparent. He even had like people wearing transparent underwear and people like judging each other's like, down there. And at a bar, like in real time, people's social credit score are going down because they made a bad joke or something like that. It was incredibly shame provoking. And that was kind of the idea. And it was satirical and very funny. But I kept coming back to the Super Sad True Love Story because what I realized is that that notion of the social credit score was actually kind of happening silently. So it was like kind of the flip of the radical transparency. It was like underground, and it was this underground sort. And it was not only just it was happening invisibly to the normal human. It was sort of at the level of the data collectors, the third-party data collectors that are like Axiom and all those enormous things. That the profiling in the cloud, like our browsing data, like who's a gambler, who's like who's a felon, who's been arrested, like all the terrible things that people can find out about us and then store. And it had the other aspect of it, which was that it's unlike the sort of very quickly moving notion in the Super Sad True Love Story, this had the kind of an infinite gestation period. Like it was just always being added to. And of course it was not a true reflection of us, right? Like the point is that it's kind of our digital doppelganger, but it's in some sense like the worst things about us. So I sort of understood it as a notion of a digital scarlet letter. And I kind of drew that connection between the Hester print scarlet letter and this like this secret scarlet letter that we don't really know about explicitly, but which nevertheless sort of we have to carry throughout our lives. In particular, those kinds of marks on our record, whether they're like evictions or again felonies or just bad habits that we have according to norms, might prevent us from getting a job, certainly might prevent us from getting housing. We probably wouldn't know it was happening. Just to be clear, when your record shows that you have a mark on your record and you get sort of denied in an algorithmic sense, you almost never get told why. So I was just realizing that these norms that we're carrying, and they don't even get updated. They're sort of infinite marks on you, and sort of they cause you potentially lifetimes of shame that you're not quite aware of, but you must bear the consequences of.
I thought you used the scarlet letter a couple times in the text, and Esther Prins or Prine. I don't know how. I think it's, I don't know. Let's say Prine.
Oh, did I say wrong? Okay, sorry.
No, I don't know if you did or I did.
Okay.
We'll just agree that it's Esther something.
Okay. It's Hester. It's Hester Print.
Hester. Oh, I didn't even get her name right. But as I recall the story, which I think I read in middle school or early in high school, it's a woman who has a child outside of marriage and has to wear an A on her body at all times, and it really evoked to me sex and sexuality and shame. And as you know, Kathy, like the last few years of my life, I've been writing about sex and in particular sexual assault.
Yeah.
And there were a few things that it kind of evoked to me. The first was, of course, the education that we give young people in sex and sexuality, which is very much about all the terrible things that will happen to you if you have sex. So here in the United States, it's about STIs, unwanted pregnancies.
That's true.
And so it's like, it's literally educating you to feel bad about or anticipate all the negative consequences of your sexual desire. And, the same thing is with masturbation or other kinds of things where young kids express their sexuality. And I wondered, And then we could, of course, also talk about, the idea of a closet and LGBTQ folks and how
Yeah.
we experience just profound amounts of shame for our sexual desires. I'm curious if there's something about sex and shame, why they seem to have a cheesy metaphor like, bedfellows in a way that go together in our society. Why sexual desires, these things of intimacy, are often such sort of lightning rods are ripe for experiences of shame.
Wow, I would have been asking you that question, to be honest. And I would also like just to give me like a couple minutes to think about how to answer that question. I would ask you, because I don't know very much about sex education, and I was wondering, is it, I mean, I think what you're saying is that it's inherently shaming in the US. And I certainly know that extreme examples of that, if you've read the book Pure, which is written by a woman who like escaped evangelical church teachings on sexuality, it's just mind blowing. But of course, probably not all that representative of U.S. sex ed. I'm wondering, are there countries that do it better, as in not as shaming?
Yeah, I mean there are places that do a better job. I mean, there's also, because of US federalism, there are states that do better job.
Yeah,
And interestingly, like it's actually deeply aligned with inequalities in the United States, because kids from more well-off families often have access to sex ed in private schools and other kinds of things that meet national standards that are sort of established to help young people have a healthier sense of their own sexuality. But I think, a lot of parents, you know, do a kind of la 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 la, I don't want to hear
yeah,
about this,
yeah,
which is inherently shaming, or even the way that we use words. Like, parents will use words like, pee pee and hoo ha rather than penis and vagina. And,
yeah,
we could kind of think about what it would mean to never say the word elbow, right? Like there was something so profoundly
yeah,
shameful about elbow that we called it your arm fold region, right? Like
yeah.
because we just didn't want you to ever think about it as anything. And
Right.
it's always covered up, right? And so, there's even this big Victorian push that we're still living through where, that even if you think about movies and how they're rated, if there's nudity in a movie, it's rated R, but you can murder somebody, right? Like that's
I've never
totally
understood
fine.
that. I've never understood that. And not to mention that you can have tender, loving, affectionate sex scenes, and that's R, but like really violent, nasty, maybe sexual things. Like I just think that's where we need the R, if it's anyway. Um, look, I think you know more about this than I do. I mean, shame is a big subject. I didn't touch on a lot of things because the real goal I had of the book was to create what I thought was a useful kind of taxonomy of when is shame appropriate and when does shame work. But most importantly, when is there shame? Because like again, like when going back to the teachers, like I didn't see it until I had to really think through it. Like it was invisible to me until it wasn't. And I find it really, really helpful to be able to recognize it, and then to say, wait, is that punching down or punching up? And wait, is that appropriate? Like overall, is that going to work? What does it take for shame to work? Because one of the dirty secrets of shame is, by the way, dirty secrets, like just such a shame driven concept, is that it feels good to shame people. And that is kind of the hijacking that social media does so well to produce such shame cycles, shame outrage cycles, and like get us addicted to shaming others. So like, there's just so many things around it that I wanted us to have a better conversation about shame. And now that I've written this book, Seamus, you and I can talk through on many walks in the future that I hope we take on like, why is sex such a ripe like spot for shame? Why it? And I guess like my very first stab at an answer is that shame is essentially a question of community cohesion, and like sex is almost the most important thing about the community, like the ongoing community. Like how does the community develop? who has sex with who else to produce which children, right? So there have to be rules around that in any community. So that's probably why that's the first place shame pops up.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I think it's pretty similar to what I would kind of say. Like, you use the word dirty and reflected upon it, and it immediately evoked to me, and here's my dorky academic sociologist thing. Mary Douglas has this book, Purity and Danger, that opens with a really sort of like evocative line where she says, dirt is matter out of place. And so things that are dirty are things that are not in place.
Mm-hmm.
And what social control is it puts the things in place that are not in place. And, you know, shame for sexuality is very much about that kind of social control. There's so much I want to say, but I want to like back up, because you've used punching up and punching down, and I haven't actually asked you about that yet. And it's really a critical analytic lever that you use in the book, because it's one where you suggest that sometimes shame can be productive, or maybe there's certain kinds of shame we should be much more concerned about than others. And the device that you use is this idea of punching down versus punching up. And so I wondered if you could just explain that to us.
Yeah, thank you. And this is, I kind of invented these notions. I mean, I really stole them from comedy. And I just tried to retool them a little bit in the context of shame, because I want us to be able to have a better conversation. I want us to be able to say, that's punching down, and here's why. For me, punching down means you are shaming somebody who doesn't have choice or doesn't have voice. And choice, what I mean by that is, like, remember, you shame somebody with respect to a norm. And the idea is you have to make sure that they have the choice to conform to the norm that you're telling them to conform to. So I would argue that poverty shaming, addiction shaming, fat shaming, those are not actual choices. Now, people will argue that they are. And a large part of the conversation I want to have is making the case that they are sometimes somewhat a choice. But the extent to which they are a choice is vastly overrated. And I think it's vastly overrated because people want to shame, because it's so useful as a mechanism to keep themselves away from that particular stigma. So that's the notion of choice. And my claim is, if you are assuming let's call it an easy choice. If you're assuming it's an easy choice, but it's not, then it's punching down. The secondary thing is voice. And that means, it can mean power. So somebody who's in power almost always has voice. But what I generally mean is like the sort of ability to defend oneself, to explain why I'm doing this against what seems like the norm, but also the ability to be seen improving, to be seen conforming to the rule. If there's the sort of right to be tracked, if you will. Sometimes people don't want to be tracked once they've been shamed. But that's the idea, is that, like, if you shame somebody who you'll never see again and will not notice if they actually improve their behavior, that's punching down. And you can see from those two rules I have, if you will. And by the way, I don't claim that they're axiomatically, mathematically perfect, just to be clear. I think they're rules of thumb. But you can see that I'm pretty much claiming that almost all social media shame is punching down, because almost always it's a stranger who you'll never meet again, who you probably will not keep track of, and you're shaming them in a way that they probably can't defend themselves well. There are exceptions, though. So the exceptions would be people who have choice and voice, right? So you shame Sarah Huckabee Sanders for lying on behalf of President Trump. And that's what that happened at the Red Hen in Virginia. Totally appropriate. Totally appropriate. She was denied dinner, denied service. And a bunch of people went up in arms about it, saying, like, it's the end of civility. By the way, civility is often a complaint about what I call punching up shame. Punching up shame is never civil. Like, and by the way, all social justice campaigns, successful or not, use shame, and hopefully use punching up shame, and were at some point criticized for being uncivil. But and I get it. People like the status quo. They like to feel like I shouldn't have to agree with everything that a proprietor of a restaurant believes in order to be served dinner. And I understand that, generally speaking, that is the case. But where I really draw the line is when some people were, people on the right, especially, of course, were claiming that this was tantamount to like how Blacks used to be denied service at restaurants. It's not, right? So the point is that Sarah Huckabee Sanders was choosing to lie, and she had the choice, and she certainly had the voice as the spokesperson for the White House. So just an example of what punching up versus punching down would look like. And punching down, of course, when you're denying an entire group of people based on something they cannot control, i.e., the color of their skin, and almost by definition had no voice in the matter. So it's just really not the same, even though sort of at a very, very shallow level it might look similar. So I wanted to give the reader a way of analyzing, like, is this comparable to that? Is it really? Are those kind of similar, or are they very, very different? And I hope I did that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I really liked, and I said this, I hinted at it before, is how you take on some difficult cases. So two examples that pop to mind are, you talk about incels. So for those who don't know what incels are, people who are involuntarily celibate. And, these tend to be, as a category of people, we think of them as like men, primarily white men. And, there's pushback on what an incel is because, are you involuntarily celibate because the supermodel that you love refuses to have sex with you? I mean, it may be that there are lots of people who are happy to be in a sexual relationship with you. You just don't want to be in a sexual relationship with those category of people. And so the question of voluntary, but you take on that case of a group of people who can be shamed. And then you talk about this woman, this case that was really sort of in the news for a while, who she was, I'll just to walk through the example in for those listening along, she was taking her dog for a walk in Central Park, and she let her dog off leash. And an African-American man came up to her and said, "Please put your dog back on leash." And he asked her to do that because he was part of a birding community in Central Park, and the dogs were disturbing the birds, and he was upset about this. And she called the police, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong in this story, Kathy. Did. And basically said, like, this Black man is threatening me. And he recorded her doing this, and there was a huge social media pylon on her. I mean, she was, as you pointed out, she was fired from her job, and she committed an act that many, myself included, viewed as racist, right? That she'd sort of mobilized police and potentially police violence against a Black man who'd asked her to do something that was actually mandated in Central Park. She wasn't allowed to have her dog off leash. And yet at the same time, there was sort of this, like, her life became unlivable for a period of time. And so I'm curious, like, how do we think through something like that? Like, we don't want people to be racist, right? And we should call out racism, but maybe our outrage is way out of proportion. Like, how do we navigate our way through that example?
Seamus, remind me what the first example is again, and I will certainly, the incels, right? Because I wanted to just address that really quickly, which is that, thank you for bringing that up, because this, as I said, I had 3 goals in this book. To develop this lens of shame, I call it. The first is to recognize shame when it's happening. The second is to say punching up or punching down. I have a little toolkit for that. The third, though, is to ask the question, is this going to work? If I shame somebody, let's say it is a choice and they do have the chance to defend themselves, and like maybe they even live with me. Maybe it's my incel son, or it's my son who's, I'm curious, like maybe I'm concerned that they might become an incel. Does it work to shame people? And the answer is maybe not. Maybe it actually backfires. And I think we really have to take that quite seriously, especially because we have been trained by social media to shame people, and because it feels good. So it's like already it's dangerous for us to do it on a whim. But especially when we're desperate to get our incel son back in line, right? So the question is, does it work? And I think it sometimes doesn't work. And that was kind of my point of the incels, is that people who are incels aren't really like choosing to be incels. I mean, I guess that in some sense you can imagine that, but I think of it more like they are desperately lonely, very horny. They fall prey to this terrible ideology, which is totally wrong. But actually shaming them for that is probably going to drive them deeper into the corner. And I think that's a one example I gave, but it's supposed to try to develop this idea that you can, by shaming someone, which by the way hurts, right? Even when it doesn't work. That's an important thing to realize. People recognize it as an attempted punch in their gut, as an attempted banishment from their community. So it is very painful, even when it doesn't work, even when the norm is not shared. It is recognized as a punishment, as an affliction. And so what you're doing is you're suggesting like you're wrong, you're doing this wrong, and you're a bad person. And then if that person doesn't feel like they can conform, they don't feel heard, etc., they're just going to run back to their community and feel further dug in, feel further isolated. And if that's what brought them there, and by the way, the incels are a great example of a community that spent a lot of time figuring out how to dig in further to the community, how to respond to people who try to shame you for being an incel. It's like that's 85% of their work is those kind of defenses. So my larger point is that like it doesn't always work. Number one, so to figure out, here's my taxonomy for like, you're my instruction guide for like whether this is going to work if you shame someone. Number one, make sure it's punching up. Number two, like make sure the norm is actually shared. If you're trying to shame, let's go back to Trump. Shaming Trump for misspelling things doesn't work. He doesn't want to misspell things right. There's something in it for him not to spell things right. So don't shame him. But just make sure the norm is shared. And number three, and this is probably the hardest one, is like you actually have to be extending that community. You have to be saying like, we're in a community together. Like, I trust you to be a good member of this community. Just you need to change this one thing you're doing wrong. So that's a kind of a trust, ongoing community trust thing, which, and this is when we're talking about between two people. When does shame actually work? Those three things are required. And then like the exception I have is when you're punching up, like when you're actually in a like social justice campaign, like, you talk about the Parkland shooter kids, they're punching up at politicians like, hey, like make better gun laws. They don't really need to be in a community because they're like holding power to account. So holding power to account looks a little different from like person to person, like healthy shame. Going back to your example of the Central Park stuff, I have a couple things to say. And the first one is, I don't think I will ever jump on the shame train of a Karen video. I do consider it punching down because it is not somebody I will keep track of. I do think it's an overreaction what happened to her. She got fired from her job. It also didn't work on her because, I accidentally, because I did the research, I have actually kept track of her because she's in my book. She is, suing people left and right for what happened to her. Her life really is ruined, and that isn't reasonable as a reaction to what she did. She made a mistake. I don't agree with her. She made a racist mistake. No doubt about it. But I still think that it's punching down. But I'm not done. Honestly, the thing that I really think about the Karen videos as a genre, if you will, of shame, of viral shame, is that it's aiming too low. It's aiming at people who are making use of a racist policing system rather than the racist policing system. The fact that white women, and I'm one of them, if I inappropriately called the police, summoned the police to complain about an innocent Black man, and I would have essentially zero concern about myself being arrested. And the Black man who I am accusing unjustly would have a very serious reason to be worried about being arrested. So that's the asymmetry that we should be punching up on. And of course, that is the system that is going to be around, that has the voice. You know what I mean? So if we punched up, on this choice of a racist policing system with a voice, like that's the worthy goal. So and that's sort of like the message of the book in general. Hopefully you agree with me that I'm kind of like, we need to aim higher. We need to like figure out, there is something shameful about all the Karen videos, absolutely. But I think the shameful thing is that it works to be a Karen. And the idea of shaming these people, I mean, I will say that it's happened enough times that it's sort of demonstrated what not to do. And I hope that white women everywhere have seen that. So it is in that sense useful. I don't want to say there's no utility in it at all. I just think that at some point we have to raise the bar and sort of like say, instead of just knowing that not to do that, what does an actual life of anti-racism look like?
So my final question to you, you have gotten at so much, and I want to thank you for this conversation, is, you make this sort of really beautiful and compelling argument about how, the Sackler family and, OxyContin and these drugs profited off shame, and how Weight Watchers and the Weight Watching industry profits off shame, and how, political parties and political policies profit off a logic of individualism and shame. And then you have this second argument, which is sort of about how social media companies can make shame go viral, or they can sort of accelerate. It's like, it's not quite a catalyst, but it is sort of fuel for a reaction. And as I was reading this, I thought to myself, like, wow, should I get off Twitter and Facebook and Instagram? Should I just not participate in these things? Or is there a way that this sort of new social technology could be handled in a better way so that they're not just shame machines? Because I think about, like, I think a little bit about like the Gezi protests and how social media was used in part as part of, it was like an intimate part of Arab Spring, which, think of it as you will, it was about a range of information spreading, the capacity for organizing, etc. And I was like, how should I carry myself as a person who's on Twitter, a person who uses Instagram, things like this? Or should I think like, actually, these are just corrupted technologies. They're just doing more harm than it's worth?
Well, that's a great question. And it's something I grapple with too. I mean, I'm no longer on Facebook, but I am still on Twitter, and I've never been on Instagram. And I actually managed to be invited to speak to the Senate about Facebook algorithms and social media algorithms and its effect on such groups as teenage girls and with respect to their self-image, their body images and stuff like that, but also misinformation, how the algorithms work. And what a long time ago, I figured out that like those algorithms, speaking as an algorithmic auditor, are too large to audit. There's too many stakeholders. Like there's just no way that if I had been hired to audit the Facebook algorithm 6 years ago, I would have been like, what we need to think about is the Rohingya in Myanmar. Like I just wouldn't have figured that out. In some sense, they are completely out of control, and there's going to be elements of chaos, and just that's just the nature of them, and that might mean they should be turned off. That might mean that, but at the very least, what it does mean is that we should think of specific types of stakeholders that are at risk and require that the social media companies address the harm that is inflicted upon those people. And I do think, certainly, suicide ideation of teenage girls because of, beauty filters on Instagram is a great example of that. I also, though, do think that this idea of like the piling on viral shame tweets and Facebook posts and et cetera, are another thing that needs to be addressed, because it is really unhealthy for us and it really divides us. The algorithm in general is optimized to make us fight. It might as well be like, that might as well be an actual encoded intention. And that needs to be addressed. It is harder than it sounds to do that, but it's not impossible. I mean, actually, they did that, and Zuckerberg turned it off because it was losing them money. So you know that it's possible. I don't want to let us stop talking though without saying that, like, I think the more direct and very, very doable changes that we could make if we had this political will would be to restructure the inherent shaming mechanisms of things like the welfare system and prison, which are, if you look through my book, I have this notion of a dignity violation, which is very, very related to like shaming design. And if you look at the list of dignity violations, which is a notion of Donna Hicks, you will see that they are embedded in the very structure of our prison system. They are embedded in the structure of our welfare system. Those design choices can be changed, probably faster and more directly than what we can do on social media. I hope that answered your question.
It did. And, unfortunately, it's all we have time for. It's always so great talking to you. I can't wait to sort of continue the conversation. For those who are watching along, I hope that you can join in. First of all, get a copy of the book, Kathy's book, The Shame Machine. It's a really wonderful read. It made me think, as you can tell, about so much. And you can find the details of how and where to get it in the chat and on the RSA events social media. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, all of you, for watching. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Seamus.